My name is Robert Harry Marshall, also known originally as Harry Marshall Jr. And the reason I say that is because when I enlisted in the military, I went to get my birth certificate, and I always thought my name was Robert Harry Marshall, but I found out the birth certificate was Harry Marshall Jr. The military at the time of enlistment, and I'll get into more detail later, would only accept what was on my birth certificate, Harry Marshall Jr. All my school records and so on and so forth were in Robert Harry Marshall. But that has been changed legally, and it is on record. But my service records are in Harry Marshall Jr. Now, the reason for that basically is that my father is a Scotsman from Canada, Prince Edward Island, and he, during the Depression, moved to Claremont, New Hampshire, and worked on the railroad bridge, which was the High Bridge, called the High Bridge, and met my mother, his name is Jeanette Muzzero, originally from Maine, but at the time the family on my mother's side was living in Claremont, New Hampshire. I was born in Claremont, New Hampshire on April 28, 1930. My father wanted to name me after his father, whose name was Ebenezer, and my mother didn't care for that at all, so she wanted to name me after her father, who was Charles, but that didn't go because of my father, so I ended up being named after him directly, which was Harry Marshall Jr. My father was Harry Marshall. Being born in Claremont, New Hampshire, I attended grammar school there. I can remember Way School, the grammar school, and the junior high school, which was called Stevens Junior High School in Claremont, and then the high school, which was Stevens High School in Claremont, New Hampshire, graduating in 1949. My career in high school was pretty standard. I was upper fifth in my class, played football, baseball, and basketball, and enjoyed those years very much. The thing in my high school period, or those years, I was brought up by my grandparents, and I found out later that my mother and father moved to Boston, and this is, of course, when times were very difficult, and my mother was having twins at the time, so I was left in New Hampshire and brought up by my grandparents, and my mother and father were in Boston, had my brother and sister as twins, and ended up having 10 children total, I being the firstborn. But that's a family story, so I was born and raised in Claremont, New Hampshire. During the summers in my junior and senior high school years, I used to visit my aunt, Julia Young, and my uncle Remy Young, who were both from Claremont, New Hampshire, but had moved to East Hartford, Connecticut, my uncle working for Pratt & Whitney Aircraft Corporation in East Hartford, actually working for the Hamilton Standard Division. And during those summer years, junior high school years and high school years, I used to stay with them in the summertime and work on tobacco farms, which were right next door, and so forth, and did that. Now, at the completion of my high school year, not having the finances in the family to attend college, I did apply to Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and became an alternate, but not having the resources, the funds to go to college or to apply to another college, that was out of the question. So my senior high school summer, at the completion of my high school year, fourth year or graduation, I did spend the summer in Hartford, Connecticut, working on the tobacco farm. The farm I finally ended up working on for several years was a company farm owned by General Cigar Company. And the gentleman who ran the farm for the company, who I had worked for about 3 years, said, "Hey, you've graduated, how about staying with us on the farm, going us to the factory?" The tobacco farm raised tobacco leaves, which were used for cigar wrappers and cigar fillers. and he says you could make a career staying in the tobacco business and go with me at the factory at the end of the farm season, and so on and so forth. I thought about that, and I thought it might have been a good alternate thing to do, but my heart was not really set on being a farmer. So at the end of that particular season, which was the fall of 1949, I went back to Claremont, New Hampshire to visit my grandparents and to make a decision what I was going to do. And the thought was in my mind to join the military for a career, for the opportunities that the military would have. And not having any resources to do otherwise, I thought that was a good alternative for training and so on and so forth. So when I reached my grandparents in Claremont, I went to a recruiting office, and I had the Navy in mind. So I popped into the Navy office, recruiting office, and I asked him, I said, if I join the Navy today, when can I leave? And the gentleman at the recruiting office, the recruiting officer said, well, he said, you can sign up today, but there's a 6 months wait to get into the Navy. And I kind of hesitated because I was anxious to really get going. So I said, let me think about it. So I went next door, and the first door I arrived at was the Air Force. So I popped my head in the door and I asked, I said, if I enlist today or sign up today, when can I go? He says, well, he says, when you get your paperwork done, he says, you can go right away. I said, that's great. So I went in, signed up for the military through the Air Force, signed the paperwork, but being of age, 18 or so, I had to get my parents' permission. And of course, my parents were in Boston, so I picked up the paperwork and said I would do that and return at a later date. So I went out onto the main street in Claremont, the downtown section, and walking along and bumped into a friend of mine, and one of my friends, and I said, he said, gee, what are you doing? And I told him what I was doing, the farm, and what I was going to do, and what I couldn't do for school. So I told him I was going to join the Air Force, and he said, gee, he says, that's a great idea. This gentleman's name was Robert Peterson. So Bob said to me, he says, hey, he says, that's a great idea. He says, I'm going to do the same thing. So we turned around, went back to the recruiting office, and he did that. And so after that was done, his parents, of course, lived in Claremont, so getting their signatures was not a problem. So we went to the local coffee shop, and it was called a sweet shop at that time. And we were in there having a soda, and another friend popped in, a gentleman by the name of Gordon Ormsby. And Gordon says, hey, what are you guys doing? And we repeated what we did, and he said, gee, he said, it's a great idea. So I'm going to do the same. So lo and behold, we went back to the recruiting office, and Gordon Ormsby, well, we call him Ormsby, that was his name, that's what we referred to him, signed up, and he did the same thing. Believe it or not, a fourth individual, Donald Martin, same thing. So the four of us ended up enlisting at the same date. Now I had to go to Boston for my parents' release because of my age. So Ormsby had a Model T Roadster with a rumble seat. He says, hey, he says, how about if we all drive to Boston, you get your mother's signature, and then we'll come back. So that's what we did. I went to my grandparents, and I said, hey, I'm going down to see my mother and father. And so we went down there, and she wasn't too anxious for me to run off to the military, but she and my father signed the paperwork, and so the four of us went off to the military. Now in Claremont, New Hampshire, we had to go to Hartford, Connecticut for the physical and paperwork and so on and so forth, which we did. And from there, by train, we went to Lackland Air Force Base in, Houston, Texas, Lackland Air Force Base. I believe it was Houston, but in that area. Anyway, the four of us went through basic training together in October. The enlistment date was October 3rd, 1949. And the four of us were in the same squadron, went through basic together and did those things. Back in those days, basic training was a 3 months process, which we did. And we took a battery of exams to determine what our qualifications were going to be for the military as far as training. When my records were done, when we finished the exams and so forth, I had 3 choices because at that time they gave you 3 choices depending on your qualifications, and with no guarantee of which of those 3 that you would be selected for. So the top one that I selected was radio maintenance. Today that would be called electronics. And then radar was the second, and the third was communications, mainly telephone and so on and so forth. So I was selected for the radio maintenance. I was given my first choice. Now, being in the Air Force, this was during the days of the Truman administration, and President Truman at the time was trying to integrate the troops, have one service, one uniform, and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of integration in the troops. The total integration of the Navy, Air Force, Army, and the Marines was never carried about. But anyway, during the interviews for the school, the person during the interview said, well, you're in the Air Force, but you have a choice. You can go to, you can take ground equipment or Air Force equipment as your training for radio maintenance. So trying to be a little bit different, and being in the Air Force, I said, well, I'll try something different in my mind. I said, well, I'll take the ground equipment. So then he said, well, you have choices of 2 schools, the Army school, Army Signal Corps school, or the Air Force school. And to be just a little bit different, I said, well, I prefer to take the Army Signal Corps school. He said, that's great. He said, that's no problem. He said, now in the Army they had 2 schools, one at Camp Gordon, also known as Fort Gordon down in Augusta, Georgia, and the other school at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. He said, you don't have a choice. He said, when they fill up the classes, whatever your class assignment will be, that's where you'll end up. And I ended up with orders going to Camp Gordon down in Augusta, Georgia, for about a 42-week school training period. So I had to leave from basic training from Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, went home, and by those days we went by train, and then from train from Claremont, New Hampshire down to Augusta, Georgia to attend the Army Signal Corps School for radio maintenance. Now back then the Army school was set up by companies, and each company for that class starting period was set up with Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guards all going to schools. And the school down at Camp Gordon, Georgia at the time included radio, telephone, radio operating schools, radio operators, and also the military police had a school there, but we were all integrated in a company, and every day we would, after breakfast, we would take our books and our poncho for a raincoat, and we used a helmet liner, not steel helmet, but the helmet liner, and we line up outside the company formation area, and all the other companies would form up, and we'd march over to the other side of the parade field to school. Then we'd march back for lunch. Then we'd march back for the afternoon school, and then march back in again for the evening meal, and so on and so forth. So that was a 42-week school. And during that period, that was basically the end of, about the end of 1949 when I finished basic training in Lackland Air Force Base, to the 42 weeks into the beginning year of 1950. When I was at the Camp Gordon school training session at the Signal Corps Army School, the Korean War broke out. Now, Camp Gordon at one time was an armored training division, and on the perimeters of the school area and the parade fields and so forth, behind all the barracks and so forth, were armored vehicles, tanks, and armored vehicles and so forth. All the Army members of our training sessions, training companies, received orders to go immediately to Korea or wherever they were being sent. And within a period of just a few days, all the vehicles that we used to notice stacked up that were in reserve were all gone, and all the Army members in our companies were gone, and they were heading for Korea or whatever training bases they were going to. The question really what we had was, being the Air Force, the Navy guys, the Marines, and Coast Guard, well, what's going to happen to us? We will certainly be getting orders to do the same thing, but they never came. We ended up in the schools, and I graduated from the Army Signal Corps School in Army in radio maintenance. Now, when I enlisted as a private, and I received one stripe as a private first class, basically, for going to the school. And because of my grades at the school, I received a second stripe and ended up as a corporal when I left the school. Now, when my orders came out, the big surprise was that my orders were not for career or not for an oversized duty assignment, but my orders were to report to Oyster Bay, Long Island. Nothing in reference to a squadron or any names of that at that particular time. So anyway, at the end of that school period, I had leave coming to me, so went back to Claremont, New Hampshire, and had a leave period to visit Claremont, my grandparents, and also Boston to visit my mother and father. Then I took the train down to Long Island, where Oyster Bay is, and I arrived on the train in Oyster Bay with my paperwork, my duffel bag, and all my equipment. Got off the train, and nobody was there. Now, I wasn't too sure what, because usually on the military, they would meet you with a vehicle, a bus usually, because usually more than one person arrives at the same time. So I asked the station master, showed him my paperwork. I said, do you know where this place is? Now, I don't remember what it was called at the time. And he said, no, I don't recognize that name. He says, but why? There'll be a taxi cab coming soon. Why don't you ask the taxi driver? So when a cab came, I went to the driver and I said, do you know this place? He said, oh, I know where that is. So anyway, I jumped in and he took me to this place, and it was an estate on Long Island at Oyster Bay. And I went through the gate, and it was the big estate, went up to the main building, and he dropped me off, and so I went in, and lo and behold, underneath that estate, the government had leased an estate for 99 years at the time. Now, all these facts are recall, whether I'm referring to these specifically, names and so forth, it's all from recall, so I may not be anywhere near 100% correct. But anyway, underneath this estate on Oyster Bay was the Air Defense Control Center for the whole Northeast, from upper Presque Isle, Maine, radar site, all the way down to Indian Gaps, Maryland. And all the radar information from aircraft coming from Europe and over, I believe, over the poles, was all the aircraft traffic was tracked, and any unidentified aircraft was reported to this Air Defense Control Center with a plotting board of all the aircraft in flight for protection of the Northeast. So anyway, those people reporting there were being reassigned to all these radar sites or the Air Defense Control Center. And during the interviews for my assignment, I would have a choice of any location that was open that had an opening for my MOS, and from Presque Isle, Maine, all the way down to Indian Town Gaps in Maryland. So the Air Defense Control Center was not open for my MOS, which was radio maintenance, but there were several open, and the one I selected was down in New Jersey at Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. Now, it wasn't a military base per se. It was a radar site with a radar station, and it was behind the Twin Lights, which were the Twin Lights Coast Guard station at one time, and it's called the Twin Lights Station at Atlantic not Atlantic City, Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, which was close to Asbury Park, and off the point was there was Fort Hancock, which I don't believe was an operating military base at the time. So that's where I started my career after being trained for radio maintenance at the radar site at Twin Lights in the Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. I was there for several months, and doing the repair work for radio, telephones, communications, and so on and so forth, and learning and applying my skills or training from the Army Signal Corps School. And this was an air base radar station, or air station. So anyway, I was there several months doing the routine work that's required, and I was on a baseball team, and it was very enjoyable. I was passing the bulletin board at the office one time, and I noticed there was a opening for going to the advanced radio school at Scottsfield, Illinois. Now, before the Korean War broke out, to go to that school, you had to be a sergeant, and I was a corporal at the time. And I said, well, I said probably I didn't qualify, but I went into the office and I inquired about that. And they said, you have the qualifications. Being a corporal does not matter, because I believe during the Korean War they were building up the training, trying to get more men trained for different things. And so a lot of the rules were relaxed a little bit to get the classes built up. So they were opening for 2 men. So I signed up and got selected to go to the advanced radio school in Scottsfield, Illinois. So I received my paperwork. In the meantime, another member of our group there in radio maintenance was selected also. I wish I could remember his name, but it escapes me. But we got to talking, and he had an automobile, and he says, I'm going to go drive to Scottsfield. You want to go with me? And I said, sure, I'd love to. And he says, well, I'm going to go I'm going on leave, and I had leave papers too before you go off to another assignment. So I went back to home, and we met at a designated place where he lived. I can't remember where that is at this particular time. So we went off to Scottsfield, Illinois, and ended up there. So I went to the advanced radio school, and the advanced radio school, back that time, most of the schools were in the neighborhood of 40 weeks of training. And so I started the advanced radio school. So basically I spent time in 2 radio schools, a total of over 80 weeks of training, which took up quite a bit of that 4-year enlistment that I had. Actually, if I remember right, I had a 3-year enlistment, and later on when the Korean War broke out, we all, because of I ended up in Japan, I'll get to that, but we ended up with what I called, or they called at the time, the Truman Extension, so everybody we were automatically extended for 1 year additional service. But anyway, I spent that 40-some weeks at Scottsfield, Illinois in training, and so forth. And because of my grades again, I was promoted to sergeant, a buck sergeant, 3-striper, at that particular time on graduation. Now, like I was saying earlier, that every time you finished the training period, you went on leave. So I went back home, and during training, there was a gentleman, and I'm trying to remember his name, but some of these friends of mine are gone. So he said, hey, there's an opportunity if we come back to this. Scottsfield was right outside of St. Louis. It was on the other side of the river in Illinois from St. Louis. So he said, why don't we meet in St. Louis? And his name may come back to me, because we met again in Japan at a later time. And he said, why don't we meet in St. Louis? We can sign up to drive an automobile to California, Oakland, California, where we're going to be shipping out our orders. We both received orders. And here again, when you graduated, everybody received an order, your orders to go to report to a duty station. And of course, we all split up in that class, went all around the world, even in the United States for assignments. Joe Grimes was the gentleman's name. Joe and I received orders to go to Japan and Misawa Air Force Base in northern Honshu, and we had to report for shipment. In those days, we went by troop ship, and we traveled by train. So Joe says, let's do this. There's a car dealer in St. Louis that will let people drive automobiles to California, to the different markets, and all our obligation is to drive the car and pay for the gas and oil. So that's what we did. So I went back home to Claremont and visited my grandparents and my mother and father, and of course my brothers and sisters. And when my leave was up, took the train to St. Louis and met Joe at a hotel. And the next day we went to the dealership and signed up to drive the car to Oakland, California. Of course, we made a trip out of it, and we had a certain number of days to arrive, and did a lot and so forth. So we did a lot of sightseeing and enjoyed the trip across the country. So when we got to Camp Stolman in Oakland, California, was where all the people going overseas were assembling. And this would be Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, and so forth. So we arrived, turned in the car in Oakland, and went to the Camp Stolman, got our assignments, and signed up with, went to the company formation, and so on and so forth. Now, in those days, as the companies were built up in terms of numbers to be shipped over to process on to aboard the ship, it took about 2 weeks, and you were pretty much confined to the base at that time and couldn't go off and visit the community. So there was, as I recall, at Camp Stolman, there was a ferry, a ship, they called it a ferry, that would ferry you from Camp Stolman down to the ocean ship in Oakland Naval Base. Now, a lot of these I'm remembering and trying to remember the times and the dates and so on and so forth in the process. But anyway, from Camp Stolman, we were shipped by ferry, and this was a huge ferry, it's not like a small ferry that you think about, down to the pier where the ship was that we had to board. Of course, the timing was such that when the time you arrived and you lined up for formation and a check of your equipment and your medical status and so on and so forth, and then you received your berth assignment and so forth, and you loaded on the ship in certain groups. I'm trying to think of the name of the ship. There was a two-stacker, I remember, troop ship. One ship I went overseas on or came back on was the USS General Manning. And I'm trying to remember the ship coming back. But anyway, so we boarded the ship, and in those days the ships were set up so you had a berth assignment, and they stacked you high, 5 high on berths, Navy berths, the bunks, canvas bunks that would fold up during the day and fold down that you could slide into in the evening, and so forth. Now, being on ship and being in the military, they often told you, well, don't volunteer for anything because you'll get assignments you might not like. So Joe and I were sitting around and we heard on the intercom system they were asking for volunteers for certain duties, assignments on ship, as you did the transatlantic, trans-Pacific voyage, which took 14 days. So we went down to the office and we approached them. We said, we heard that there were assignments that we could sign up for. And so they said, sure, these are the lists. This is the list. So we looked down the list, and what popped out was the library assignment. So we inquired about that, and they said, oh, we have a library on board which anybody can sign out books, and you sign up to run the library, and it takes 2 people, and it's one to relieve the person during the day, and for dinner, to go to the head, things of that nature. And so what we do is we give you the key, and that's what you do during the day. You can alternate, take turns, and we can get 2 or 3 other guys, and you can share the duty. And so we thought that was a great idea, which turned out great because we had this special room, which was the library, reading chairs, and so on and so forth. And what we did was sign out books, and of course a lot of the servicemen didn't take advantage of that, and we could sit there and read, and when chow time came, we could run off, take turns and run off to chow, and things of that nature, which turned out good because we found out later that some of the guys were swabbing the decks and chipping paint and doing all those things that the Navy guys did and so forth. So it really turned out to be a good assignment for us. We arrived in Tokyo Bay 14 days later. And we disembarked at a big warehouse, and we all lined up and called off by name, and we ended up on trains that ended up several days or whatever the time was to go up to northern Japan to Misawa Air Force Base, which was my overseas duty assignment. When we arrived at the base, of course, Joe went off. He went off to a different assignment. We didn't go in the same location. Joe went south to Ashir Air Force Base, which is on the southern island of Japan. I was on the main island of Honshu, way up north. So anyway, when we arrived at that duty station, and here again the ranks are thinning quite rapidly because everybody's going in different directions, I ended up at Misawa Air Force Base in the little town of Old Misawa, Japan, where we arrived by train. It was very interesting because this was 1952 at this time, early 52. The war in Japan had ended in, the late 45 or so, and it was still part of the occupation. We were still part of that occupation force for Japan, but the war was pretty much, the people were pretty much settled in. The civilians, was very little trace of the war at the time, and so we didn't even think about it, but we were on the base most of the time, and I just recall that because of having leave and visiting different places, that the signs of the war up in northern Japan was pretty much gone. I'm pretty sure that in the cities there were still signs of the damage and so on and so forth. But anyway, at Misawa Air Force Base, I was in the radar section, which was a separate unit from the base itself. The particular base, Misawa Air Force Base, at the time was doing special fighter, bomber type of work assignments to Korea. Our involvement was the radar and the control of flights in and out of different places, both to Korea and also northern Japan, and the coverage for aircraft coming into that particular part of Japan. And my duty assignment was the radio communications maintenance at the radar site. Now, when I arrived at the duty station, we were put up in large tents because barracks were not done at the time or completed. They were building barracks for buildings for the troops on the base, but that was still in progress at that particular time. And I imagine this was an expansion of the base because of the Korean War. I have to say that my duty stations were not combat, and my relationship during the Korean War with Korea itself was non-existent at all, except for the communications part that I played. So anyway, the buildup of the air base, I'm basically guessing, was because of the Korean War. Barracks were being built. It was a big expansion. The Army had the 1st Cavalry there with anti-aircraft guns, the big 120 millimeter guns that were like pulled by large tank-like vehicles, tractor vehicles, and they were stationed there. So We did get to know people, men from the 1st Cavalry, whose duty was to protect the base there from aircraft. Now, in our company squadron in tents, it was very interesting because I'm from New Hampshire, so cold weather and camping out in the winter and things like that was really not a problem for me. Being in the Boy Scouts and an Eagle Scout and camping in the winter was not a problem, but we had men in the military that were from southern climates, Georgia, Alabama, and so forth, that cold weather was not the best thing for them. And so our big squadron tent, I can't remember how many men it slept, but they had double bunks, or double one bunk over another, and that's how I used to sleep. And at each end of the tent was a potbelly stove. In those days, they were coal-fired. So I remember that the fires were fine, but people would go to bed, we'd go to bed, lights were out at a certain time, which was required by the military, and they used to stoke those stoves up, potbelly stoves, and when the lights were out, because they were stoked with coal, and you could see them glow red, and that used to keep us warm, but of course nobody would bother to get up and go out and get coal to stoke them at night when it was late. So they'd be cold in the morning, and to start a coal fire was not an easy thing to do. It took time. Those are kind of experiences that you think about. The tents were in a square formation. In the center of the square was a bigger tent where we had showers and cleanup areas and so forth. So to get from a tent, and in the northern Japan, the weather was like northern New England in the wintertime. It was cold, a lot of snow, and we were issued Arctic equipment, which meant that we had our regular issue, and your regular issue consisted of 2 blankets for your bunk, and Arctic issue included a additional 2 blankets and a special parka with hood and long underwear, special boots, and things of that nature, and gloves and so forth, which is over and above your regular issue, which of course you have to keep track of and turn in at the completion of your military. Another thing they issued was a wool cardigan, butt in the front type of sweater. They were pure wool. But the thing a lot of the men didn't realize that wool, you can't wash them without them shrinking. So they had to be handled separately. If you brought your wool sweater in your duffel bag, or you're cleaning your bag for your laundry, and left it in with your laundry, it would get thrown in with the laundry. And a lot of the guys would come back with sweaters that would just about fit a doll because they shrunk. And then, of course, you get embarrassed. And if you brought it back to the sergeant to get a new one, they weren't very happy about that situation. But that's kind of a thing that you learn sometimes by making mistakes. But anyway, we had a snowfall during that period in the winter. We had a 38-inch snowfall, a 48-inch snowfall in 36 hours. The snowfall lasted it was such a short period and so much snow that the whole base was shut down for 3 days. Now, the priority on plowing and clearing the roads was on the runways to keep the air traffic going because of their supportive career from that base. And the only way we could get to our duty station, the 1st Cavalry had the tractors that when they moved the guns around, those 120 millimeter guns, they had these big tractors, vehicles that were like tanks. And of course they would haul people in them because they were designed not as a weapon, but as a vehicle to haul the personnel that worked on the 120 millimeter guns. But normally we would go to our duty station, which was the radar site, which was at the end of the runway, which is quite a distance from where we were camping, or where our barracks were, so forth. So we assembled, and normally that would be by bus or sometimes by truck. But because of the snowfall, we had to use those. They brought those, they operated those, so we could get through the deep snow down to our duty stations and back and forth. kind of an experience that you run into that you normally wouldn't. Also in Japan in the spring, they had earthquakes, and Japan is noted for its earthquakes, and some are very serious. Now, Misawa Air Force Base was right beside the ocean, Pacific Ocean. And it was fairly elevated from one of the villages that was nearby that was on the ocean. It was quite a distance, but if you traveled the area, you knew it was there. Being in communications, we received a teletype message as a warning that there was an earthquake in the ocean that did generate a tidal wave, and it was being broadcast that a 1,000-foot tidal wave was approaching the coast of Japan. And of course, we could read the communications, so that was dispatched right away to headquarters because it was to alert the base, to alert the local civilians, because communications in those days was very minimal. And so the base, and we did not get involved in that other than the communication, was to send people out, MPs especially, to warn the coastal people that this tidal wave was about to approach. And of course, they could estimate the time, which they did. Now, the base was elevated above the ocean several hundred feet, so the tidal wave was not going to be a factor for the base, or even an earthquake tremor, so forth. But we did find out from the local papers and the base communications that when that did strike the coastal towns, that particular period, not everybody was warned, and several people had drowned, and the villages were basically wiped out. And I know a lot of the base personnel went to help after to support the Japanese villages at that particular time. I was not involved in that. This was all from the communications that we received at the station that we were at. When we used to play baseball out in the fields there, you could look across the field, somebody say, look, and you could see a tremor. And what the tremor did was raise the earth like a wave, and you could see this moving along, and you knew that if you were in a building, that tremor and that shock wave, which it was, would rattle and shake and sometimes destroy windows and so on and so forth. This was a common occurrence back in 1952 at our base, and everybody knew about it, and you could see this wave coming, and you say, well, when it comes, I'll jump over it, but when it arrived and went by, you just didn't know it was there. But then you go back to the barracks, and somebody would say, oh, well, we had a tremor. And of course, the monitoring earthquakes like they do today was not done as much then, or done at all to speak of. But those are interesting facts that we ran into when we were in Japan. And occasionally we'd be in the barracks, and you'd be in your bunk, and all of a sudden the whole building would shake, and everybody would jump up, but then it'd be gone. So there was not a lot of damage done at most of these. A very high percentage was just a little tremor. I'm trying to think of some of the other occurrences in Japan, but I remember one time we were out strolling, a bunch of us, and we were in military uniform, and we were cutting across the field, and this was in the evening. Sometimes you'd go to the base theater for a movie or something, and when we were in Japan at that time, you could not bring civilian clothes with you. You had to always wear military clothes. That's changed a lot since then. You can have both civilian and military clothes, but back then you would only be allowed your military clothes, no civilian clothes. So we used to get dressed, go to a movie or something, and one time we sort of strayed in the wrong direction getting back. We weren't lost or anything, we were just walking and talking. All of a sudden we heard this noise, and we looked up, and there was an oil tank or something of that nature there, and lo and behold, without knowing it, it was guarded by Japanese forces, which were part of our service at that particular time, so forth. Of course, they're trying to a particular Japanese with a weapon, whether it was a loaded weapon or not, we don't know, tried to tell us in Japanese to halt, that we were in a forbidden area. So it was very obvious when it was brought to our attention. So we motioned, signed, and by that time we could speak a few words of Japanese. So we backtracked and left the area. But even back then, there could be dangerous situations. Now, when we arrived, we were all issued weapons. Now, the training weapon when we were in Lackland Air Force Base that we had to qualify with was the carbine, which was issued when we were in Japan, was issued to us. But during training at Lackland Air Force Base in basic training, we had to qualify on the carbine. There was two weapons, and actually three weapons that we had to be familiar with. One was the carbine, which was the standard Air Force weapon, and the .45 automatic pistol, which we all had to qualify with. And then we also used what they call the grease gun, which was a machine gun, 45 caliber, very short-nosed, and we had to fire that for effect. You didn't have to qualify for that, just had to learn how to fire it. With the 45 and the carbine, we had to shoot targets and qualify. One of them I was a sharpshooter, which is on my record, and the other was marksman. Can't remember which weapon. But when we arrived in Japan, in the States, you were never issued a weapon. In basic, you had a weapon, but you were never given ammunition unless you were on a firing range. You used the weapon, a carbine. Most of us, well, all of us were issued carbines. But when we arrived at the base in Japan, at the Air Force, Misawa Air Force Base, one of the things we were issued with our Arctic gear was basically a carbine and a .45 automatic and ammunition. Of course, you were never supposed to load a weapon unless you were going to use it, and you were never supposed to use it as such, but it had to be there at your duty station, mounted on your bunk, so you never carried it with you. Other than your duty assignments, you had to carry your carbine with you and bring that with you. I can't remember now on the .45, you just couldn't leave them laying around, but we had footlockers which we kept locked up, and the .45s were kept in the footlocker locked up, and your carbine was mounted on the bed. And everybody had to memorize their serial numbers and also for your weapons. I don't remember my weapons serial numbers, but I do remember my Air Force serial number. Let me try to repeat it for record. It was AF 11195-823. I can check that on my paperwork, but I believe that's correct. That was my Air Force serial number, which we all had to repeat and memorize at all our duty stations, so forth. I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm trying to recall most of the things that we did when I was in Japan. We used to go on weekend leaves and so forth, and back in those days, you could get a carton of cigarettes for $1, and I never smoked, but we had a carton, we had a cigarette ration, and I believe we had a whiskey ration. And so we had a card, and it was your cigarette ration, so you could go to the PX, and you could buy a carton of cigarettes for $1. And I never smoked, but we used to trade. So I'd buy my carton of cigarettes and put it in my footlocker. And then we used to have a whiskey ration. So we used to get a fifth of VO at the NCO club. Oh, I understand I have a few minutes remaining. Don't tell me that 90 minutes has gone by so fast. But anyway, let me just go quickly. I'll skip that. But anyway, I was shipped back to the States by ship out of Yokohama in Tokyo Bay back to Seattle, Washington, and I took a train from Seattle. Back in those days, my enlistment was up. The commanding officer had asked if I would like to ship on for another duty assignment and re-enlist, and I would have been automatically, back in those days, promoted to technical sergeant, but I had in mind of going to college, so I rejected that and told him that I had other plans, and I took a train from Seattle back to Westover Air Force Base, where I was discharged on October 3rd, 1953. From there, I went back home to New Hampshire. I worked a half a year in a machine shop in Springfield, Vermont, and applied for college, and I went to the University of New Hampshire. And I often told a lot of friends of mine the best thing that ever happened to me was going in the military, because my electronic roots started with two schools, the Army Signal Corps Radio School, the Advanced Air Force Radio School. Then I ended up at the University of New Hampshire with the GI Bill, where I majored in electrical engineering. And my GI Bill at that time consisted, for the Korean War, took care of my tuition, which at that time was $125 a semester, which is unheard of at today's cost, and took care of most of my books. I had to work and pay for my meals. I played baseball there, so my meals were covered in the spring and so forth. But that's what I did. And when I left the University of New Hampshire, I went to Boston, worked as an engineer for Comstock and Westcott in Boston, where we used to go to White Sands Proving Ground, where we did instrumentation on the Navy Airby High rocket. We put our instruments for the Air Force Research Center in Cambridge, Mass., where we did radiation study, which I believe was probably the pre-start of the shuttles and all that out-of-space type of work. I'm getting ahead of myself because of timing. From there, I went to school nights, got a degree in engineering management at Boston University, and then I moved to Hamilton Standard, where I had an opportunity to work on the space program. When I lived in Boston, my wife Nancy and I had two children, Seth Andrew Marshall, and my oldest daughter, Allison Sears Marshall. When we moved to Long Meadow, Massachusetts, near the Springfield, Massachusetts area, I worked at Hamilton Standard in Hartford, Connecticut, and worked on the space program, the Apollo program, Skylab, Space Lab, and the shuttle. And I was responsible for all the testing for our flight equipment that we sold to the government, and the laboratory and instrumentation at Hamilton Standard, where I retired after 26 years, and am now retired in the community. I was a scout leader for 15 years. I'm now in the Shriner of the North American Shrine Organization, and right now, at this moment, in 2003, I'm the Shrine Potentate, which is the CEO of, or head of our Shrine organization in Western Massachusetts, out of Springfield, Mass., and active in our church, which is the First Church Congregational Church in Long Meadow, Mass. I've since then had two more children, Brett Stephen Marshall is our second son, third child, and my youngest daughter, Lindsay Jeanette Marshall, so forth. So, do I have any more time? I'll just keep on until...
You can finish up.
Okay, so forth. So anyway, my involvement, being retired, has been actively in the community. Right now, active with the Shrine, active in the church, and I belong to the Galaxy Club at Westover Air Force Base. And the Galaxy Club is business people or people in the community that want to participate and support the Westover Air Force Base. The club does their air show, is very much responsible for earning monies for the air show that they have every 2 years at Westover Air Force Base. And we have access to the base. They have a monthly meeting. And I enjoy it because it gets me back onto an Air Force base And of course, the Galaxy Club is named after the Galaxy aircraft, the C-5A, which is very instrumental in the Gulf Wars and so forth, and ferrying equipment over to the Gulf. But anyway, I've had opportunities to fly on the C-5A. When I retired when I was discharged at Westover, we had the Globemaster, which is a 4-engine piston aircraft. Now we have at Westover the largest aircraft that the United States makes, which is the C-5A Galaxy. I enjoy my Air Force connection still, and like I said, I always considered the Air Force military the best thing that ever happened to me, because it led to a career path which allowed me to do the things that I became very interested in through the GI Bill and training, and especially the Army Signal Corps training I think is some of the best in the world, and of course the Air Force training is second to none. I don't know what else I can contribute to saying, but the military part of my life, I didn't make it a career, but it's something that I've always remembered and always contributed to be where I am today. And I thank everyone here for the opportunity to go through my very limited, short career in the military. Thank you.